everyone, welcome. We're bringing the world's most promising minds to discuss today's most pressing challenges. Today, we'll be discussing the challenges and opportunities posed by sustainability. We're here at PA Consulting's Global Innovation and Technology Center in Cambridge, UK. This is where critical strategy work meets actual physical execution, and it's happening across material science labs, robotics, design studios, automation hubs, and the intersection of AI and human needs. My guests today are Dr. Wayne Visser and Nathalie Bödtker-Lund. Professor Wayne is a globally recognized pracademic, poet, and possibilist. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And listed as the world's top 10 ESG speakers, a top 100 sustainability leader, and the recipient of the Global CSR Excellence and Leadership Award. He's also the founder of CSR International, director of Kaleidoscope Futures Lab, fellow at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and former director of sustainability services at KPMG. He's the author of 44 books, including the bestseller Thriving, and his work has taken him to 82 countries. Welcome, Dr. Wayne. It's a pleasure having you today.
Great to be here.
Thank you. I am also joined by Nathalie. She is the Global Head of Impact and Sustainability at Sweden-based Polpak. Polpak are the owners and inventors of a unique technology aimed at replacing single-use plastics called dry molded fiber. There, Nathalie leads Polpak's strategic sustainability initiatives to create positive impact throughout the industry. She works closely with cross-functional teams to develop and implement innovative sustainability practices that align with Polpak's mission to replace single-use plastics. Nathalie has a varied background, working both in the corporate world, managing sustainability strategy, as well as being the director of a nonprofit sustainability organization. She describes herself as a creative visionary, but also a targeted doer. And I'm Tony Parada, regenerative economy expert here at PA Consulting. Dr. Wayne, before we get started, I have to say I love your description as a pracademic, poet, and possibilist. Could you share with the audience what that means for you specifically?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Great pleasure to be with you. And I have to say, unless we bring the innovation agenda to these challenges, we really don't solve them. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and I'm delighted to be doing that with you. Well, what is a pracademic? Quite simply, a practical academic. It's about taking ideas, which really can change the world, but turning them into a practical application, bridging the worlds of academia and practice, and that's what I like to do. A poet, hopefully everybody knows what that is, and I'll share some of that towards the end of this interview. But a possibilist is interesting. I didn't coin that term. The wonderful statistician Hans Rosling, who wrote a book called Factfulness, coined this. And really it's about saying that change is always possible. So rather than saying I'm an optimist or a pessimist, those are quite fatalistic viewpoints. It's to say that the world is and always does change, and we are agents in that change, and so change is always possible.
Brilliant. Brilliant description. Nathalie,
Yes.
Polpak sounds like an incredibly promising technology, one with deep resonance and special need in today's world. Can you help us understand intended purpose, why it's so unique, what makes it so special?
Yeah, thank you. That was a very nice description. So about 72% of all plastic packaging ends up in nature. That's about 150 million tons of plastic packaging each year. That's a huge amount. So Polpak aims to replace single-use plastics with a more sustainable solution, dry molded fiber, which I will talk about a little bit more later.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so let's begin the conversation with the debate around sustainability still being considered the cost. So there's a school of thought that suggests the lack of a climate action plan is the lack of a business continuity plan, and that you are equally as likely of getting put out of business by climate change as you are competitors. However, there's still a large number of industries that still view sustainability as a landscape of trade-offs. It's still an added costs. Help us understand why that's still the case in this day and age.
Yeah, well, the business case for sustainability is something that's been long on the agenda. And in fact, it's been getting stronger and stronger. It's formed by things like the risks that are represented when you don't tackle sustainability, whether that be climate risk or risk of stakeholders turning against you. It's the cost savings you can make when you have eco-efficiency. It's the reputational benefits you have. It's young people wanting to work for your firm. So the war for talent. I mean, many elements of the business case are well understood, and they have been getting stronger. But we are also in an economic system and in a market system that doesn't at the moment consistently reward the companies that are addressing sustainability and punish those that aren't. And that's a lot to do with market pricing. So we don't price in what the economists call externalities, basically the social and environmental costs that particular economic activities impose. You already mentioned plastics. There are huge environmental costs to plastic, which are not reflected in the price of the product or the material. So we need to really work on the pricing system, the market mechanism. We need to look at capitalism as a whole and start to question the shareholder-driven capitalism that we've adopted from mainly America. And so we need to get the signals right. But the fact is that companies can do extremely well if they embrace sustainability. In fact, many of the fastest growing and most profitable sectors today, if we look at clean tech, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit about today, these are the ones that are really changing the world, but also making their companies extremely successful.
So in essence, this is truly a complex systems-based problem that requires many inputs and viewpoints.
Yeah.
Okay. Nathalie, building on that, I imagine you have an amazing new innovative technology. Oftentimes that takes individuals and organizations that are willing to be on the bleeding edge of new tech and take it to commercial scale. Are you finding similar challenges that Wayne expressed and described?
Both, yes and no.
Okay.
And I think the challenge is that it's a new technology, so no one has tried this before. So people are, of course, a bit scared or like, what is this? How does it work? So I think also you need to be brave and open-minded when it comes to new innovation and new technology. I see that's happening more and more, I think, which is great. But I think it's also depends on what industry you are in. Before I was working in the supply chain industry and like paper and printing industry, and they were far behind. So I think where I am now with Pullpack, I can see that it's more like in the front run actually.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great to hear.
Yeah.
I think as well we understand how innovation works, right? Innovation always is taking a leap of faith and is more expensive to start with. But then as we get economies of scale, we get the learning curves, we get the investment coming in, those costs go down and it becomes price competitive. The question is whether it gets the support at the early stages, whether that's from venture capital or indeed from policy. In terms of subsidies, for example, or taxing the alternatives, which are actually the dirty technologies. And what we still see today is that many of the dirty technologies, such as fossil fuels, get massive subsidies, while the renewables actually get far less. Even so, if we talk about renewables, they're out-competing fossil fuels because they've gone through that learning curve. And in fact, they've shown themselves to be, for the market, preferable, far more competitive, and they're being deployed at scale. And so that's what we need for all of the solutions, including those that Pullpack is working on.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's not only, it can also be a way of understanding, and people, they have a lack of knowledge, I think. So we need to educate and we need to explain even more and more. So those people taking those decisions can, be calm when it comes to the transition. So I think that's also a huge part with the educational part as well. Yeah.
And a bit of a provocative question in each of your opinions, which do you think will likely be more effective to get us where we need to go? The carrot or the stick? Is it taxing dirty tech, or is it incentives for clean tech, or is it truly a combination of the two?
I think this is partly a geopolitical question, because what we actually see is that America favors the carrot and Europe favors the stick. And we probably do need a combination. I would say that on the carrot, we've had an experiment for the last 50 years of deregulation, of actually saying government, this is particularly in America, needs to be smaller and smaller, as little policy as possible. From a sustainability point of view, that's been a disaster. It has actually failed. And so that's why we also need to learn from the European experience and other parts where legislation has been stronger, has been more progressive, has set the rules of the game, and has then allowed innovation to take place. And, the European Green Deal is a good example of that. Suddenly, with the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, in some ways, the US has caught up and maybe even leapfrogged by saying, actually, good, solid legislation creates a market-enabling environment.
Okay.
Mm. Just one example, I was working for a global company with a head office in Sweden, Gothenburg. They were far behind when it came to sustainability. But what I could do is that I could go to our CEO and say, hey, this is not my idea of doing something. We have to do this by law. So I think it was a great tool for me to put that pressure to the company, and also to make conversation with our biggest customers, asking them what is the most important things, signing up for science-based targets or all those kind of things. And then I could go to the CEO and say, so here are the results. And then he said, well, let's sign up for science-based targets. So I think also to ask the customers and have a dialogue with them. And I think the legislation is also helping people like me in my role to navigate and make things happen.
Okay. Yeah. There's a crucial distinction here, what's good policy and what's bad policy. And bad policy is telling business what to do, actually backing specific technologies, for example. What good policy does is look at the problem and legislate the problem. So to say, okay, we've got a climate change emergency, we need to radically reduce carbon emissions, and therefore we set the target for where we need to get to and how fast. We then leave it up to business to innovate, to find the solutions. That's good policy, rather than picking solutions and telling business that they need to do that or this.
Yeah,
right.
I agree.
Okay. So let's take a moment and pivot. It's easy to feel a sense of overwhelm at just the scale of the monumental challenges we face as global citizens. What would you share are the bright lights, the promising technologies that will show scale and really create some impact? What are the breakthrough innovations that you feel holds great promise?
Yeah, as it happens, the new book I'm working on is looking at 10 technologies which I believe are transforming and will transform the world. And I won't go through them all, but if we look at how change happens, it's not a linear process. It's not a slow, stepwise change. Change is always exponential. We often talk about this as being tipping point change. So it appears to go really slowly. We see lots of resistance, and then it reaches the steep part of the curve, and it changes very, very fast. As it happens, I lived through the transition in South Africa from apartheid to democracy. We had 40 years of resisting that change. Many lives were lost. And then when it happened, it all happened within about 5 years. There are some technologies that have already passed that tipping point. Certainly renewables, so if we talk about solar, wind, and batteries, that's past the tipping point. If we look at EVs, electric vehicles, that's already past the tipping point. So these will continue to scale. They're scaling at an incredible rate. And, sometimes we need to also look at who is leading the charge. And, if we look at China, we often think they're the problem. But in fact, China installed more renewables last year than the rest of the world combined. We're probably going to see 2023 as the year when they peaked emissions. So they've been very strategic about investing in the right sorts of technologies. But there are many others that are incredibly exciting. So everything we're doing around green hydrogen and green ammonia, what's happening in the food sector, so particularly technologies like precision fermentation, cellular agriculture. Biomaterials is very exciting, and we'll talk more about that, I think, because of what Poolpack is doing. Earth information systems. We now have data about how the Earth is functioning and the ecosystems that we've never had before. We've just put up a satellite called a methane satellite that can detect where there are methane leaks, bearing in mind that over a 20-year period, methane is 80 times more impactful than carbon dioxide. And then we have, of course, the new kid on the block, artificial intelligence, that has its own set of problems, as every technology does, huge energy footprint, but will also bring solutions to many of our sustainability problems.
Okay, brilliant. Nathalie, biomaterials.
Yeah.
Hugely interesting space.
Yeah.
It connects directly to this notion of an Earth information system. By the way, I love that moniker. How does Poolpack play into that?
So I said dry molded fiber in my introduction. And what is that? So it's basically the opposite to wet molding, which is the most conventional fiber method today. Okay. So imagine, take out the water, save more energy, and then you have dry molded fiber. So that's like Poolpack's, technology and main idea. I think we still need some products, like people want to have their coffee to go or whatever. And then to have like that kind of product instead of the plastic, I think that's a really good output. And you can save up to 80% CO2 emissions by this technology. So that's a step forward when it comes to single-use products, at least.
So in essence, you've created a technology where not only are you increasing your sustainability profile, but to your point on energy use dropping, then the cost per unit comes down, and you can eventually make this, actually not eventually, even now, commercially scalable.
Yeah. Okay. You also save a lot of time. So this is like, when you talk to the customers, and you start with environmental aspects, and then they are waiting about the costs or cost savings. So then you have both. So I think that's a great incitament as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this question of materials is so crucial because we can't start off from the position that says, you're going to have to give up everything that you've been doing and everything you've been using, everything you've been buying, right? We've tried that for 50 years on sustainability. It doesn't work. You can't scare people into sustainability. And the story we've been telling has all been about sacrifice. You won't be able to fly anymore. You won't be able to buy products. You have to, everything has to be secondhand, reused. It just won't work. And so looking at the materials we use is crucial, and just finding better alternatives. Now, one of the alternatives to plastic is bio-based materials. Plastic has been a very useful product. It is ubiquitous, but it is also disastrous for the environment. Not only is it fossil fuel based, so it's propping up that climate inducing sector, but also, of course, it always leaks into the environment. That's even before we look at something like microplastics, which are getting into our bodies. And so anything that can provide us with a good alternative to that is crucial. Of course, we also need to tackle the problem. We've got a global plastics treaty that's being negotiated, which will tackle the pollution element of plastic. But actually what we need are good alternatives. And anything that's bio-based, this is one half of the circular economy, right? Circular economy is recycle what is sometimes called technical nutrients, so things that we've made artificially, and plastics is a good example of that. But also, as much as possible, take things from nature, using nature, that can go back harmlessly to nature. That's a second cycle. And the more of that we can have, I think the less we'll have to be dealing with the toxification of the environment that comes from things like plastic.
There's an interesting thesis that suggests today about 10% of fossil fuel use is eaten up by the plastic industry to create more of this material. And the thesis looks at if we replace and find alternatives for that, you can redeploy those fossil fuels for what are critical needs, at least in the next decade: water desalination and air conditioning and cooling. So there's an added advantage to finding those alternatives even faster, in addition to the environmental aspects that you mentioned. What we've been seeing is a clear shift, especially in the world of packaging, towards fiber of all kinds. So yes, of course, dry molded fiber. You mentioned wet molded earlier. As entire industries move towards the use of more fiber, what implications do you think there are for forests and forestry? We all have experience of e-commerce where it feels as though we're drowning in carton stock. Will that have implications, and what are your thoughts there?
Of course, when you talk about fiber, it's not only virgin fiber. You can also use other fiber, cellulosa, from other different products or materials like algae or hemp or that kind of materials as well. So I think that it's a very tricky question. I mean, we have seen in Europe that the forest has actually growth. We have growth with forest area in Europe, at least. But what kind of forest is that? So I think you also have to separate like the old forest that is protected, that you shouldn't touch. And then you have the other forest that is used, the materials are used. And then you have to make sure to, how do you take care of the forest? And I think this is also depending on where we are in the world. We have a quite good system in Europe. I think also, Sweden and Finland, a very good system of taking care of our forests because we have an old tradition of doing that. But then if you look into the Amazonas or other areas, huge problems. And so I think you have to be careful if you are using the virgin material, the virgin cellulosa, where does it come from? And you need to make sure that it has a good certification. There are certifications today. Maybe we need to have even better. There are coming new legislation also in this area, which I think is great. But I think for the future, a combination of, if we want to use the forest, make sure that, do it in the right way. And even better, to use recycled materials, recycled fibers. And fiber can also come from other materials like algae or agricultural waste, for example. So also to make sure that, look into other aspects of the fiber production. Yeah.
And some of the work that we do with you at Polpack that we're very proud of is exactly that, exploration into alternative materials like agricultural waste, non-agricultural based fibers. And what's unique, Wayne, you had mentioned this notion of sacrifice before. We're realizing that picking other fibers doesn't mean we're losing characteristics. They may bring unique characteristics that other materials don't have. And still bring the design experience, the elegance, and the consumer experience that a premium package should do. So it does not have to be a landscape of trade-offs.
Yeah. And you've got to also step back and look at this as a solution in contrast to something that is using a non-renewable resource, fossil fuels, that is creating a global problem, climate change and air pollution and other issues. What we're talking about here is a renewable resource. So that's already a win. This is something that can renew itself. Trees can be regrown, right? And so the more we can use renewable resources, the closer we get to that regenerative economy. Okay. Of course, everything we use has impacts. And so it's very important, as you say, to look at which forests, how are they managed. And we have things like the Forest Stewardship Council, the FSC certification, which is a great step in the right direction. We have Rainforest Alliance certifications. We can always do better. We can continue to improve those. But that's step number one. Ensure that these are certified forests. We have now, of course, in Europe, the legislation against deforestation for commodities. So all commodities coming into Europe have to prove that they aren't from deforested land. I was just last year in Brazil looking at the soy production there. And, they're very conscious of these standards and ensuring that the supply chains are clean and are sustainable. So they want to come with a solution. But the important thing is that, if we do it right, not only is this a renewable resource, it actually does have other environmental benefits. Forests, they create oxygen, they filter water, clean water, they do create habitats. Of course, natural forests create more biodiversity habitats than commercial forests, and there's ways we can improve commercial forests to do that. But it has a number of other benefits beyond just being a commercial source of timber and fiber. And then, as you mentioned, there's so much innovation going on in alternative fibers, which are really, really exciting, whether it's, using literally other materials like hemp or like algae, we can get fiber from a lot of different places. But also the work going on around precision fermentation and cellular agriculture. So, I've just reading in the past week or so, about cotton as a source of fiber, which actually has really bad environmental impacts, lots of water. If I remember the numbers correctly, it's something like 12% of the world's pesticides are used on cotton, and it provides 2% of our fiber. And now we've got cellular agriculture that's starting to grow cotton fiber in the lab. And so we can take away many of those impacts. So again, it comes back to, can we use innovation to bring the solutions we need with much lower impact, but still all the benefits from the materials that we need?
And we talked earlier about this notion of, again, the regenerative economy, in essence, moving beyond net zero. And I think a lot of those examples speak to, yes, this is a great alternative, but it brings a host of other benefits. We also discussed the role of technology into the future will likely focus more emphasis on technologies that can answer multiple problems at the same time. In addition to what you shared on biomaterials, we talked about biochar. Here's a process that sequesters carbon long term, provides a value for waste residuals, helps amend soil health, and also reduces water. A solution that has 5 different impacts is something that really holds promise. How can we find more of those in the future, I think will be key. Okay.
Yeah, I call this synovation. So innovation that brings synergy, that solves multiple problems at the same time.
Synovation.
And just on biochar, I mentioned to you off camera and off mic that I did an interview with James Lovelock, who came up with a Gaia hypothesis, NASA scientist, the idea that the Earth is a self-regulating organism. And when I talked to him about climate change, he said, the only way we're going to get the volume of drawdown of carbon, absorption as a sink of carbon, is by working with the agricultural sector, turning that agricultural waste into biochar, plowing it back into the soil. There are some marginal fertility benefits there as well. But essentially, you're fixing carbon at very low cost, high scale, because every year the world's agriculture is absorbing carbon. So rather than going for what are still fairly untested and very inefficient technologies like direct air capture or like carbon capture and storage, yes, let's continue to invest and improve that. But actually, agriculture is doing it for us already. We just need to do the last step, which is fix that carbon.
Yeah.
Okay. You heard it here. All hail biochar to start. Okay, let's tackle an interesting and potentially controversial topic, recycling. Recycling's been hailed for a long time as the holy grail. I think the sentiment now among global citizens is maybe that reputation is not quite there yet, and it isn't the panacea we expected. Do you both still recycling is truly useful and productive? And if so, are there areas where it's more meaningful and impactful than some others? Nathalie, would you like to start?
It's like a lot of times we create systems that we think are the best. Yeah, and we get stuck there. We just stick on the same system for a very long time. So I think we have a good infrastructure. I mean, of course, in Sweden we do have it, and in Europe, a lot of countries, maybe not so good in other parts of the world. But I think also to have this idea, I don't know if you have heard about industrial symbiosis, which I think is very interesting, to also have a more circular way of using, materials and recycled materials within an area. It could be like where you live or a business area with industries. So maybe the recycling, the next step could be more that kind of circulation of materials. But it's a big infrastructure step, so maybe it's not going to happen within a couple of years. But if you're looking in the more in the front, many years above, maybe that could be a good transition towards a more circular society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, Kollenberg in Denmark is the great example there of industrial symbiosis, and even chemical companies, big chemical companies like BASF have what they call Verbund sites, which are basically where the waste of one part in the industrial complex becomes an input, a raw material to the other part. So yeah, we can be much smarter on that. But I think let's put this into context. Do we need more recycling? Let's reframe that as, do we need to move from a linear economy of take, make, waste to a circular economy? Absolutely, because there's no way we can continue to use resources at the rates that we're using them with a growing population and economies coming out of poverty, consumption going up. It just doesn't work on a finite planet with planetary boundaries. So we have to make that change. How far have we got to go? Well, in fact, we're less than 10% circular globally as an economy. So a long way to go. Recycling is not quite the same thing. It's part of that solution. So let's always remember there's a waste hierarchy. And, it starts with, choosing first to refuse new things that you don't need. It includes reducing the amount of waste that you produce. It includes reusing, repairing. Recycling, in a way, is the very last thing you want to do, because that's when it's finally become waste and you want to give it just maybe one or two more cycles of use. But it's not the ultimate solution if what ends up comes out at the end is still a problem. Okay. And at the moment, plastics, as an example, is still a problem once you've recycled it however many times you can. There are some ways to make it more infinite, such as chemcycling, turning it back into the molecular structure, but that takes a lot of energy. So one of the issues with recycling is that recycling itself takes resources and energy. And so we need to do it. We need to do it better for those products that are designed in a way. We need to improve the design, because most of the products and materials we make today are not well designed to be recycled. What we do is we merge those technical components like plastics and metals and chemicals with natural components, biological components. And what you want to do in a circular economy is keep those separate so that they can each go into their own cycle, the biological cycle going back to nature, the technical cycle going back into production. So we can do much better. But I want to just make a final point on this. One of the issues with recycling, not only are we not doing it very effectively, so there are things that are very recyclable. And I mean, if you look at PET, what most plastic bottles are made of, it's very recyclable, but most of it doesn't get recycled. If you look at, things like aluminium, 100% recyclable, but we're still not getting to those high percentages all around the world. So these are things we have to do much better. But there is a sort of psychological problem with recycling, which is that it's put forward as the solution to sustainability issues. It's what I can do as an individual. And so what happens is something called moral licensing. I put something in a recycling bin at home or in a shop, at a coffee shop or whatever, and I think I've done my job. I've done my bit. I've done my bit to save the world.
Wish cycling, we call it in the US.
Wish cycling, I like that. And so what that actually does, why it's called moral licensing, is then it allows you to do other things which are bad for the environment, but you've done your good thing. So you can go off and, you take long-haul flights or whatever it may be, drive still a polluting car. And so we have to realize it's one very small part of the solution. And there are other better ways to solve the waste problem, which are mainly about designing for there to be no waste.
Okay. And that's inherently the role of innovation and technology. Like, let's not make this a sacrifice for consumers, where we find that beautiful intersection of convenience and experience and the added benefit of sustainability. You've got that magic equation in place. Okay. Before we come to a close, Dr. Wayne, where can people learn more about your work? We mentioned your book, Thriving. You were gracious to mention you have another book on the way. For anyone interested in learning more, where should they seek you out?
I'm lucky, or perhaps unlucky, that I'm not hard to find. So a simple search you'll find more about me and more importantly the resources that are out there. So whether it's the books, the 44 books, or or the podcasts. I've got 2 podcasts, one called Purpose Inspired, another called Thriving. The Thriving one, I've interviewed many people on, how they're dealing with bringing about a regenerative approach to the economy and society and nature. So, you could seek those out and, pursue your passion wherever that may be.
Brilliant. Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You have been working with sustainability for how long? How many years?
More than 30 years.
More than 30 years. And for me, it's like about not more than 10 years. So I'm quite new. And you? How long?
15.
Yeah, okay, yeah. What would you say? I mean, you have been around for a while. It would be interesting to just hear reflecting on, if you go back 30 years, the biggest challenges and what have we, can you like say something about what we have actually fulfilled, or like, are there any highlights that would you like to just reflect on?
Yeah, well, I got involved in the lead up to the Rio Earth Summit, the original one, which was in 1992. I got involved as an economics and commerce student, and we were sort of bringing the youth voice to that agenda. And what was interesting that long ago was sustainability was quite new, at least formally. It was 1987. It was coined by the UN, and then that global summit a number of years later. And at that moment, the challenge was, firstly, let's say, putting some data to the challenges. So we knew that we already knew about climate change, we already knew about desertification, about, pollution. All of these problems were already on the agenda, but we didn't necessarily have all the data to back it up. And we didn't have the let's say, the political consensus, and we didn't have the business activism on it. Yeah. So we were still spending a lot of time convincing people of the problem. Mm-hmm. What's changed today is I don't think any credible business leader needs to be convinced of the problems, or political leader for that matter. And so now it's more about how do we create an enabling environment to scale the solutions, and how do we do this transition? In fact, in the book Thriving, I talk about 6 great transitions we have to go through. For example, on ecosystems, from degradation to restoration of ecosystems, on resources, from depletion to renewal, and there are others. But how do we go through these transitions in a way that is socially just? And I think this is, back to geopolitics, one of the biggest issues we face. Why do we get so much resistance to sustainable solutions? It's because some people feel they will lose out as a result. Mm-hmm. Not only will they personally have to sacrifice whatever it might be, their favorite car or their holiday, but it's more about, if I'm working in an old industry, how do I make the transition to the new industry without getting left behind?
Losers.
Exactly. And we need to learn from our mistakes in the past, because when we've ignored those people, we get the sort of geopolitics that we've seen, the sort of rise of the Trump-type politics, which is all about fear, counting on people's fears. And so we need to be helpful in that transition. Mm-hmm. We need to say the transition needs to happen, because people also suffer as a result of not tackling sustainability challenges, especially climate change. But we can't leave people behind.
Exactly.
And that's the crucial thing.
Yeah.
So the agenda has changed. The other thing that's changed, I would say, is it was very much focused on the problems before, and we were hopeful and wishful about the solutions. I remember strangely going to a mock interview when I was a young business student with a fossil fuel company, and asking them, this was already back in the late 1980s, early 90s, about what they're doing about renewables, and they didn't really have a plan. Some of them still don't. So, but what's different today is that it's all about the solutions, and actually, so many of these solutions are scaling at a phenomenal rate. It's very exciting. It's an amazing time to be working in sustainability,
so there should be more hope. But what I see is that young people are so stressed about this, and they are so much pressure, and so that's why it's a bit like, because we have solutions and there is a positive, you have this kind of energy. But what about our, the young people? Why can we not reach them with this positive energy? Why is that whole?
So I think a personal confession on my side is I think the moniker sustainability may not be the best term to use moving forward.
Yeah.
I think it denotes this notion that there's an esoteric concept out there. This is new work that we have to do to correct previous ills.
Yeah.
It's a very pejorative, negative connotation. As many Americans, I'm first generation American. My parents emigrated from Italy. As a child, there was an intense and appropriate, just proper resource stewardship. We didn't call it sustainability. We called it just living life appropriately. Be very careful with the resources you're using. Be conscious and present about it. Seek to waste less. And that was a very easy to understand notion. Whereas I think sustainability begins to take on this sense that I can't do it alone other than recycling. And I don't know that anyone wants to actually sustain the activities we're taking today.
Yeah.
We have to move beyond it.
Yeah, and it's a jargon concept. Let's face it, it's something we've invented, a label, and it doesn't resonate for most people. For most people, their eyes will glaze over if you say sustainability.
Yep.
And we get caught in this bubble as professionals working in this space. It's one of the reasons why I shifted to talking more about regeneration, or particularly thriving. I mean, everyone knows what it means to thrive. At the end of the day, sustainability, if you take it literally, is just about surviving. It's about sustaining ourselves. That doesn't get anybody up in the morning. You certainly don't turn to your partner in the morning and say, I hope we have a sustainable relationship.
I hope we sustain our marriage.
I mean, we do hope for that, but actually people want to thrive. They want their families to thrive. They want their cities to thrive. They want their businesses or their countries to thrive. People get that. They know what it means.
Yep.
And that's the key to the hope piece. We have to overcome people's skepticism, their cynicism, because we've been promised so much before. But hope is not something passive. It's certainly not false hope, and it's certainly not blind optimism. And I make this point a lot in the book and in many of the talks I give, which is that hope is based on action. It is an attitude, so we can choose to be hopeful. But in the end, it's about understanding how change happens and that it is happening.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I did the book, just bring together hundreds and hundreds of examples of amazing things that are happening that most people don't know about because the news doesn't cover them. Certainly the social media hardly covers them. So we're tuned into the wrong things. But it's not something passive. And I love this quote by Rebecca Solnit, a wonderful American writer and journalist. She also writes for The Guardian. She's got a book called Hope in the Dark about how social movements happen. But she says hope is not something where you feel lucky, like a lottery ticket where you sit on the sofa and feel lucky. It is an axe we break down doors with in an emergency.
Yeah.
And we're in an emergency. So hope is something very strong, very active. And it reminds me as well of something called the Stockdale paradox. So this was an American Navy admiral who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam for a number of years. And how did he survive that? He said, well, it's a paradox because you have to face the brutal reality. You can't be in denial. You can't have wishful thinking. And we need to do that in sustainability. We have social and environmental challenges that are huge, that are sometimes overwhelming, many getting worse, not getting better. But then you also have to believe that change is always possible, and that it will happen, and that it can be better. And we have lots of evidence for that, for how those changes are happening. And that also links to the message I'll share with you more poetically at the end, which I think is that this is the time for us to make the world a better place, and we can do it.
Nathalie, I think it's worth pointing individuals who want to learn more about PulPac to your website.
Yes.
pulpac.com, or anyone can obviously come to PA Consulting.
Yeah.
Just want to say thank you both for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. We definitely need more open dialogues about this, where we don't talk about just one side. We really see the problem from multiple angles, with a keen eye towards solutions. So thank you both again. I'm Tony Parada. It's been a pleasure calling here from PA Consulting, where we bring ingenuity to life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We would love to close with your poem, Wayne. It's time.
It's time to redesign, to reconceive the world we leave for those who follow in our wake, for each child's sake. It's time to spark and innovate, to syncopate with new ideas beyond the fears of failures past. At last, it's time to rise with fire burning in our eyes and change our ways to giving, for life and for the living. It's time to realign, to reassess the mess we make when what we take is more than need, is greed. It's time to halt life's slow decline, the heinous crime of ecocide, the plastic tide, the skies of smoke that choke. It's time to heal the dying soil, to ease the workers' toil, and make new waves of daring with love and with great caring. Yes, it's time to redefine, to resurrect the hope that springs with wings of acting boldly now. With minds that beam, it's time to dream of futures green, to reinvent our fate, to help the earth regenerate. Where waste is food renewed, it's time to turn from death, to take a breath, to start afresh and make a mighty pivot for life and all who live it. Thank you.